Jack Donovan, a 38-year-old man, was an example of material success. Owner of a chain of luxury hotels spread across the United States, his life was defined by exclusive dinners, first-class flights, and endless business meetings in glass-walled skyscrapers. Yet, despite all of this, Jack constantly felt a deep void, as if something essential was missing. He lived in a Manhattan apartment with a breathtaking view of Central Park, but he rarely had the time to appreciate it. His routine was meticulously planned, with every minute dedicated to expanding his empire. His few friends joked that he had the Midas touch, but Jack knew this touch turned everything into gold, except happiness. He avoided emotional entanglements with people. Growing up in an emotionally distant family, Jack had learned early on to build walls around himself. After his father passed away during his teenage years, Jack threw himself into work as a way to cope with the pain and the absence of genuine connections. His mother, Margaret, a sweet and gentle woman, now lived alone in a modest house in Connecticut. Although Jack supported her financially, his visits were rare. Recently, Margaret had called him, expressing her loneliness. "Jack, the house feels so empty that even the sound of the wind keeps me company." He promised to visit her soon, but he never seemed to find the time. It was always, after one more contract or once this merger is finalized. Little did he know that this visit would be more than just a family reunion, it would be a clue to a transformation that was about to change his life. Emily was only 7 years old, yet her green eyes carried a melancholy far beyond her years. She lived in Boston with her mother, Sarah, a dedicated nurse working grueling shifts at 2 jobs to support her daughter. Sarah had been a single mother ever since Emily's father, a man unwilling to take on any responsibility, disappeared before Emily was even born. Despite the deep love she felt for her daughter, Sarah rarely had time to show it. Emily, like any child, longed for attention. She dreamed of afternoons at the park, playing on swings, and bedtime stories. Instead, she spent most of her time alone in the small apartment she shared with her mother. When Sarah returned home from work, exhausted, all she could do was ensure Emily was fed and safe before collapsing into bed. One particularly lonely afternoon, Emily decided she would explore the world. She packed her little pink backpack, tucking in her teddy bear and a packet of cookies, and slipped out the door while Sarah was working her second shift at the hospital. The little girl wandered for hours until she reached a forest on the outskirts of the city. At first, she felt adventurous, pretending to be a brave explorer. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, her courage gave way to fear. Tall trees and unfamiliar sounds surrounded her. Emily, unsure of how to find her way back, sat on a fallen log and began to cry. Her young mind swung between regret and a desperate hope that someone would find her. The night brought with it a biting cold, and she clung to her teddy bear, wishing with all her heart that her mother was there. Jack Donovan was on a business trip in Boston, but after a tense and unproductive meeting, he decided to leave the city for a few hours to clear his mind. He got in his car and drove to a trail in a forest on the outskirts of town. Although he wasn't a nature enthusiast, he felt the need for a moment of tranquility, far from negotiations and the glowing screens of his phone. The afternoon was beginning to fade into evening when Jack, amidst the silence of the forest, heard a distant sound. At first, it seemed like just the wind, but as he listened more closely, he realized it was the sound of a child crying. A chill ran down his spine. What would a child be doing here alone, he wondered. Driven by a mix of concern and curiosity, he followed the sound, straying off the main trail. After a few minutes, he spotted a little girl curled up on a fallen log. She clutched a teddy bear tightly, tears streaming down her dirt-streaked face. Jack, though typically uneasy around children, crouched down slowly to avoid scaring her. "Hey, Are you okay? He asked, his voice gentle, surprising even himself. Emily looked up at him hesitantly but gave a small nod. She was too exhausted to run or resist. Jack took off his coat and draped it over her small shoulders, shielding her from the growing cold. My name's Jack. What's yours? Emily, she replied softly. Emily, where are your parents? I don't know. I got lost, she said, clutching her teddy bear even tighter. Jack felt a pang of concern, an emotion he wasn't accustomed to feeling. He reached for his phone, but the signal was weak. Without hesitation, he picked Emily up, noting how light she was, as though the weight of the world had made her smaller. Let's get you out of here, okay? I'll take you somewhere safe. Emily, despite her fear, felt a sense of comfort in Jack's arms. He carried her back to his car, shielding her from the cold and encroaching darkness. As he drove, he realized he couldn't simply leave her at the police station or a shelter. Something compelled him toward a different destination, one he couldn't fully explain. He decided to take her to the one person he knew would care for her, his mother, Margaret. As Jack drove toward Connecticut, he glanced at Emily in the rearview mirror. The little girl had fallen asleep in the back seat, still holding her teddy bear. Her face, now peaceful, bore traces of dirt and dried tears. For the first time in years, Jack felt a sense of responsibility for someone else. He could have taken her straight to the police or a hospital, but something urged him to do more than the bare minimum. Something told him this was just the beginning of a journey he never expected to take. The drive to Margaret's house was long, but Jack didn't mind. His thoughts lingered on how his mother would react to the arrival of such a small, vulnerable girl. Margaret had always been a welcoming woman, but since his father's death, she had retreated into solitude. Jack hoped that Emily might bring a glimmer of joy into his mother's life, even if only temporarily. When they arrived at Margaret's house, it was already past 11 at night. The living room lights were on, as always. Margaret had a habit of keeping the house well lit, perhaps as a way to fend off the emotional darkness that surrounded her. Jack parked the car and stepped out, carefully cradling Emily in his arms so as not to wake her. Margaret opened the door before he could even knock. Surprised to see her son at such an hour, she furrowed her brow, but her expression quickly softened when she noticed the sleeping child. Jack, what's this? Who is this child? She asked, trying to keep her voice calm, though her concern was evident. Mom, this is Emily. I found her lost in the woods. She's scared and alone. I thought she could stay here for the night until we figure out what to do, Jack explained. Margaret's gaze rested on Emily with immediate tenderness. It was as if something inside her stirred at the sight of the little girl's vulnerable face. Of course, Jack. Bring her inside. Jack laid Emily down on one of the living room sofas, covering her with a blanket Margaret had brought. As the girl continued to sleep, Jack gave his mother a brief explanation of what had happened, carefully leaving out his own discomfort and uncertainties about the situation. You did the right thing, Jack, Margaret said with a gentle smile. This little girl needed someone, and you were there. Jack didn't respond, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he had done something more meaningful than closing a business deal. The next morning, Margaret woke before sunrise, as she had done since becoming a widow. The usual silence of the house was broken by a sound she hadn't heard in years, a child's laughter. Intrigued, she went downstairs and found Emily sitting on the living room floor, playing with an old board game Jack had left there decades ago. Margaret couldn't help but smile. Good morning, sweetheart, she said as she approached. Did you sleep well? Emily looked up hesitantly at first, but Margaret's warm tone quickly put her at ease. Yes, I did. Thank you, Emily replied. Are you hungry? How about some pancakes? Emily smiled for the first time since she had been found, and Margaret felt her heart warm. Preparing breakfast had never felt as meaningful as it did in that moment. She moved around the kitchen with an energy she hadn't experienced in years, humming an old tune from her youth. As they ate, Jack walked into the kitchen, surprised to see his mother so lively. He couldn't remember the last time she seemed so full of life. Someone's in a good mood today, Jack commented, grabbing a cup of coffee. You've brought light into this house, Jack, Margaret replied, glancing at Emily. Or maybe it's this little visitor who has. Jack felt a twinge of discomfort. He wasn't used to being credited for bringing anything positive into someone's life, but he couldn't deny the change in the atmosphere. He noticed how comfortable Emily seemed with his mother, as if she had always belonged in that space. Later, Margaret took Emily to the garden. The day was sunny, and they sat on a wooden bench while Margaret showed her the plants. Emily seemed fascinated by the flowers and the birds that visited the garden. My mom loves flowers, but she never has time to plant them, Emily said, her tone carrying a hint of premature wisdom. Margaret looked at the girl, sensing the depth of her words. There was so much love in that small statement, intertwined with sadness. In that moment, Margaret decided she would do everything she could to make Emily feel welcomed while she was there. As the day went on, Jack and Margaret noticed that Emily was beginning to open up. Her laughter now echoed through the house, and she moved about with curiosity, exploring her surroundings. Yet, in quieter moments, her gaze still carried a shadow of sadness. Jack realized it was time to better understand what had brought the little girl to the forest in the first place. After dinner, Margaret suggested they all gather in the living room. She made hot chocolate, and Emily sat on the sofa, hugging her teddy bear. Jack, speaking calmly, began asking her questions, careful not to pressure her. Emily, do you remember how you ended up in that forest? He asked gently. Emily looked at her teddy bear, then at Jack. Her face reflected a mix of hesitation and relief, as though she was finally ready to share. I ran away from home, she said, almost in a whisper. Margaret exchanged a worried glance with Jack but remained silent, letting the girl continue. My mom works a lot. She's a nurse. She's almost never home. When she does come home, she's so tired she can barely talk to me. I know she loves me, but sometimes it feels like she forgets about me. Emily's words carried the pain of a child who loved deeply but also felt invisible. Margaret moved closer and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. And you decided to leave to find something different? Jack asked, trying to piece it together. Emily nodded. I thought it would be like the stories I read, where kids go on adventures and find magical things. But I got lost. Her voice trembled, and tears began to roll down her face. Margaret quickly embraced her, holding her as if she were her own granddaughter. Sweetheart, you are so brave, Margaret said softly. And do you know what's most important? You found someone who wants to help you get back home. Jack watched the scene, feeling a tightness in his chest. There was something in Emily's story that made him reflect on his own childhood, the times he felt alone despite being surrounded by material things. Silently, he made a promise to do whatever it took to reunite Emily with her mother. After Emily shared her story, Jack spent much of the night in deep thought. He knew he couldn't leave things as they were. Despite his initial hesitation to get emotionally involved, he now felt a responsibility that pushed him far beyond his comfort zone. The next morning, while Margaret entertained Emily in the garden, Jack began to take action. Sitting at the dining table with his laptop, Jack searched for recent reports of missing children in Boston. After a few minutes, he found a news article, "Nurse Searches for Missing Daughter." The article mentioned the name Sarah Williams and included a blurry photo, but it was enough for Jack to know he was on the right track. His heart ached as he imagined the despair of that woman. Jack picked up the phone and made a few calls. First, he hired a private investigator to confirm the information and pinpoint Sarah's location. Then, he called Margaret, who was in the garden with Emily, to share the update. "Mom, I think I found Emily's mother. I'll need to head to Boston soon to confirm," he said. Margaret glanced at Emily, who was laughing as she tried to catch a butterfly. Her emotions were conflicted. On one hand, she knew the little girl belonged with her real mother. On the other, she felt an undeniable attachment growing between them. "Make sure she's okay before taking Emily back. This little girl has been through so much," Margaret replied. A few hours later, Jack received a call from the detective. Sarah had reported her daughter missing 2 days earlier and was desperately searching for Emily. The detective had managed to find her address and additional information. Jack felt a mix of relief and anxiety. He knew he was close to resolving the situation, but he couldn't ignore the emotional impact this would have, not only on Emily, but also on him and Margaret. That evening, during dinner, Jack decided to talk to Emily. "Emily, I think I found your mom. She's in Boston, looking for you." Emily stopped eating and looked up at him with wide eyes. "You're going to take me back?" she asked. Jack hesitated for a moment. "Yes, I will. But I want you to know that while you're here, you're safe, and you're very loved." Emily gave a faint smile, but there was a touch of sadness in her eyes. She missed her mother but didn't want to leave behind the warmth she was receiving from Margaret and Jack. In the days that followed, as Jack waited for final details about contacting Sarah, Emily's presence in his life began to spark a transformation he hadn't anticipated. Accustomed to a rigid routine focused solely on work, Jack started dedicating more time to small moments he had previously overlooked. One sunny morning, Emily convinced him to join her in the garden. Despite his initial resistance, he eventually gave in, and soon the two of them were kneeling in the dirt beside Margaret, planting flowers Emily had picked out. Emily laughed as Jack clumsily tried to handle a trowel, clearly unskilled in the task. "I don't think you've ever planted anything in your life, Jack," Margaret teased, laughing as she brushed the dirt off her hands. Jack looked at his own hands, now covered in soil, and, for the first time in years, laughed at himself. "Maybe this is a sign I need to step out of my comfort zone more often," he replied with a grin. Later, Emily suggested they have a picnic in the backyard. Jack, who rarely took breaks for lunch, helped Margaret prepare sandwiches and laid out a checkered blanket under the shade of a large tree. They spent the afternoon talking and playing, with Emily leading the way in inventing games on the spot. Jack found himself smiling more than he had in years, and he began to wonder how such a small, unexpected presence could have such a profound impact on his carefully guarded life. "You should smile more, Jack. When you smile, you're less scary," Emily said with the blunt honesty only a child could muster. Jack laughed again, feeling a lightness he hadn't experienced in years. He realized how Emily had the unique ability to turn simple moments into deeply meaningful experiences. That night, as he tucked Emily into bed, she held his hand and said, "Thank you for taking care of me. I like being here with you and Margaret." Jack felt a lump in his throat. "We like having you here too, Emily. But I promise you'll be with your mom again soon, and everything will be okay." She nodded, her eyes slowly closing. Jack stayed by her side for a few more minutes, watching as her breathing became steady and calm. He couldn't help but reflect on how this little girl was teaching him something money had never been able to, how to savor simple moments and cherish human connections. 2 days later, Jack received a call from the private investigator confirming Sarah's address. She lived in a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of Boston. The investigator carefully described her situation. Sarah was exhausted and clearly distraught over her daughter's disappearance. Jack knew it was time to act, but not without preparing Emily for the reunion. That morning, he sat down next to Emily on the couch while Margaret brewed tea in the kitchen. "Emily, today we're going to see your mom," he said, watching her reaction closely. Emily was silent for a moment, clutching her teddy bear tighter. "Do you think she'll be mad at me?" she asked in a quiet voice. Jack smiled, trying to reassure her. "I think she'll be very happy to see you. She's missed you so much." Emily nodded, though her eyes still betrayed a hint of uncertainty. A few hours later, Jack and Emily stood at the door of Sarah's small apartment. The building was modest, with weathered brick walls and a tiny garden at the entrance. Emily clung tightly to Jack's hand, her small body tense with anxiety. Jack knocked on the door, and they heard hurried footsteps from the other side. When Sarah opened the door, her face immediately reflected a mix of relief and shock. Her eyes filled with tears as they landed on Emily. "Emily," she exclaimed, her voice breaking as she crouched down and opened her arms wide. "Emily!" Sarah cried, dropping to her knees to embrace her daughter. The little girl let go of Jack's hand and ran into her mother's arms. Their hug was long and tight, filled with tears and murmured words only the two of them could understand. Jack stood at a distance, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders, but also an unexpected emptiness settling in its place. When Sarah finally stood, holding Emily's hand, she turned to Jack with a mixture of gratitude and wariness. "You're Jack Donovan. The detective told me you were the one who found my daughter. I don't know how to thank you." "There's no need to thank me. I just did what anyone should do," Jack replied, trying to downplay his role. Sarah invited him inside, and they sat down in the small living room. She explained how desperate she had been over the past few days, juggling her job at the hospital and the search for Emily. Jack, in turn, shared how he had found Emily in the forest and how Margaret had cared for her while they worked on finding her family. "It sounds like you did more for her in these few days than I've managed to do in months," Sarah said, her voice trembling with emotion. Jack shook his head, unsure how to respond. He realized there was something extraordinary about this woman, a quiet strength and an unconditional love that he was beginning to admire. After a few hours of conversation, Jack sensed that Sarah was trying to balance her gratitude with a need to assert her role as Emily's mother. She was polite, but there was a subtle tension in her words, as if she were striving to prove that she could handle everything on her own. As Emily played with her teddy bear on the living room rug, Sarah turned to Jack, her eyes locking onto his. "I appreciate everything you've done, truly. But why did you get so involved? A man like you, with such a busy life, didn't need to do more than drop her off with the authorities." Jack was caught off guard by the question but didn't try to avoid it. He understood that Sarah wasn't being ungrateful, she was simply protecting herself and her daughter. "When I found Emily, she seemed so lost and scared. I just knew I had to help her. And later, when I saw how my mom grew attached to her, I realized maybe I could do a little more." Sarah crossed her arms, her suspicion still evident. "Your mom." Jack explained how Margaret had welcomed Emily and how the little girl had brought a newfound sense of purpose into his mother's life. He tried to keep his explanation brief, but he felt his words couldn't fully capture the depth of the changes he had witnessed. "I don't want this to sound like I'm trying to take any role in your lives. I just wanted to make sure Emily was safe until she could be with you again," Jack concluded. Sarah's posture relaxed slightly, but she still seemed weighed down by her own worries. I love my daughter more than anything, but it's hard, really hard to be a single mom and work so much. And hearing that someone else made Emily feel safe and happy in just a few days, it's hard not to feel. She hesitated, searching for the right words. Like you failed her. Jack finished gently. Sarah looked at him with surprise, as if he had read her thoughts. I try my best. But sometimes it feels like it's never enough. Jack felt a wave of empathy for her in a way he hadn't expected. He understood the feeling of never being enough, of carrying a burden that seemed impossible to share. Sarah, you're doing the best you can, and that's more than enough. Emily knows you love her. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time. This time, Sarah looked at him with a bit more softness, as though she was beginning to believe his words. Emily interrupted the moment, tugging on her mother's hand. Mommy, can Jack and Margaret visit me someday? She asked. Sarah was visibly surprised by the request but nodded, smiling faintly. Of course, sweetheart. Jack recognized that this small gesture of acceptance was a sign, perhaps there was room for him to remain a part of Emily's life, and maybe even Sarah's. In the days following Emily's reunion with her mother, Jack found himself unable to stop thinking about Sarah. He reflected on their conversations, on the strength she displayed in raising Emily alone, and on the vulnerability she tried to hide but which had touched him deeply. Something about her made him want to know more, understand more, and, much to his own surprise, find a way to help her. On the other hand, Sarah couldn't ignore the impact Jack had had on her and Emily's lives. Despite her initial reservations, she began to see him as more than just a wealthy stranger who had crossed her path. He was genuine, even when he tried to hide it. One day, Jack called Sarah to ask for permission to visit Emily and Margaret. Of course. Emily talks about Margaret every day, Sarah replied with a soft laugh. I think she misses her. It's nice to hear that. I'll bring her by for a visit, if you don't mind. And if you have time, it would be great if you came too. My mother would love to meet you. Sarah hesitated for a moment but eventually agreed. A few hours later, they were all gathered in Margaret's garden. Emily ran to hug Margaret the moment they arrived, while Sarah watched the scene with a bittersweet smile. Jack approached Sarah, offering her a cup of tea Margaret had prepared. It seems like they've created a special bond, he said, watching Emily laugh as Margaret showed her how to care for the newly planted flowers. It's remarkable. Emily rarely opens up to anyone like this. I think Margaret has something magical, Sarah replied sincerely. I think it's something you and my mom have in common, Jack said without much thought. Sarah looked at him, surprised, and Jack realized the weight of what he had just said. He quickly looked away, feeling a little flustered. Sorry, I didn't mean to sound. It's okay. It's a rare compliment, she said, interrupting him with a smile that eased the tension between them. As the day went on, Jack and Sarah found themselves opening up to each other about their lives. Jack shared his obsession with work, how he had neglected his mother for years, and how finding Emily had shifted his perspective. Sometimes, it takes something unexpected to make us realize what really matters, Jack said thoughtfully. Sarah nodded, resonating with the truth of his words. That's true. I always thought I needed to work harder to give Emily the best, but really, all she wants is my time. The exchange of confessions created an unexpected connection between them, something neither of them could quite name but couldn't ignore. At the end of the day, as Sarah and Emily prepared to leave, Sarah turned to Jack, her voice carrying a warmth and lightness that hadn't been there before. Thank you, Jack. For everything. Thank you for everything, Jack. Not just for helping Emily, but for caring. Jack smiled, realizing that this growing connection might be more than just a friendship. After that visit to Margaret's house, the interactions between Jack, Sarah, and Emily became more frequent and natural. Emily, happy to see her mother more relaxed, began suggesting activities that could involve everyone. One Sunday, Jack invited Sarah and Emily for a day at the park. Margaret, who loved spending time with the little girl, came along as well. At the park, Emily ran across the grass while Margaret and Sarah watched her from a bench. Jack returned with ice cream for everyone, a simple gesture that made him feel connected to a kind of life he had never experienced before. "I can't remember the last time I ate ice cream sitting in a park," he remarked, watching Emily laugh as she tried to keep her own cone from melting too quickly. Sarah smiled, savoring the lightness of the moment. "Looks like you're starting to learn what life outside of offices and meetings is like." Jack chuckled. "I think you and Emily have been teaching me more than I ever expected." As the afternoon went on, they improvised games, fed the birds, and even took pictures together. Margaret suggested a picnic for the following weekend, an idea everyone eagerly agreed to. That evening, as Sarah and Emily prepared to head home, Emily made an unexpected request. "Mommy, can we spend more time with Jack and Margaret? I like being with them." Sarah looked at Jack, surprised. He seemed just as moved by the little girl's words. "We'll talk about it, sweetheart." "But I think we can," Sarah replied, smiling at Jack. After they left, Jack stayed in the garden with Margaret, quietly admiring the flowers they had planted days earlier. "You've noticed it, haven't you?" Margaret said, breaking the silence. "Noticed what?" Jack asked, though he knew exactly what she meant. "You're already a family, even if you don't see it yet. Emily brought you all together, and you know this is something you can't ignore," Margaret said. Jack stayed silent for a moment, letting his mother's words sink in. He knew there was something special there, something he had never imagined possible. That night, after Sarah and Emily returned home, Jack found himself alone in his Manhattan apartment. The luxurious space, once a symbol of his success, now felt cold and empty. He opened a bottle of wine, sat on the balcony overlooking the city lights, and began reflecting on the changes happening in his life. For years, Jack believed that his dedication to work was the key to happiness. He had built an empire, earned respect in the business world, but as he watched the city lights reflect off his wine glass, he realized he had never experienced anything as genuine as the moments he shared with Emily, Sarah, and Margaret. He thought of Emily's smile as she ran through the park, the way Margaret seemed rejuvenated by the little girl's presence, and the way Sarah looked at him, with gratitude and a touch of admiration. These memories made him question his priorities. Jack reached for an old photo he kept on the shelf, a portrait of him as a child with Margaret and his father. He barely remembered that time, but he knew it had been happy. His father had worked hard but always found time to be present for the important moments. Jack realized he had lost that essence over the years, sacrificing everything in the name of success. For the first time in years, Jack turned off his phone without checking work emails. He grabbed a notebook he rarely used and began listing what truly mattered. First, spend more time with Margaret. Second, help Sarah and Emily in whatever way he could. And third, discover what it really meant to live. The simple act of writing down these goals made him feel something new, as though an invisible weight was being lifted off his shoulders. He didn't know exactly how he would make these changes, but he was determined to start. Before going to bed, he picked up his phone and sent a message to Sarah. "Thank you for today. I think I've learned more about life in one day with you all than I have in years of work. I hope we can do this again soon." He hesitated for a moment before pressing send, but once he did, he felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in a long time. As Jack reflected on his life, Sarah was having a moment of introspection as well. After putting Emily to bed, she sat at the kitchen table, holding a cup of tea that had gone cold in her hands. The silence of the apartment was broken only by the steady ticking of the clock on the wall, marking time that seemed to pass more slowly that night. Jack's and Margaret's presence over the past few weeks had brought changes Sarah never anticipated. For so long, she had carried the weight of being everything for Emily, mother, provider, and counselor. She had grown used to setting aside her own needs and emotions, believing there was no room for vulnerability. She recalled the way Jack looked at her in the park, how he seemed genuinely interested in helping her, not just fixing the situation. There was something different about him, something that stirred a mix of hope and fear within her. She stood up, opened a drawer, and pulled out an old photo album. Slowly flipping through its pages, she paused at a picture of herself with Emily as a baby. Tears welled up in her eyes. Have I done enough for her? She wondered. Despite working tirelessly to provide a decent life for her daughter, Sarah knew there were moments when Emily needed more, her presence, her full attention, not just the quiet, exhausted love she could offer after long hospital shifts. Jack and Margaret had brought a new kind of joy into Emily's life, and it made Sarah question whether she was ready to let more people into their world. She feared that relying on someone again might leave her vulnerable, as it had when she trusted Emily's father, who abandoned them as soon as responsibilities surfaced. As she pondered, the sound of a message notification broke her thoughts. It was from Jack. Thank you for today. I think I've learned more about life in one day with you all than I have in years of work. I hope we can do this again soon. She read the message several times, smiling without realizing it. Despite her reservations, something about Jack made her want to try. For the first time in a long while, Sarah felt she might be ready to let someone get close. A week after their park outing, Jack and Sarah's relationship seemed to be growing stronger. However, something still gnawed at Sarah, the stark differences between their worlds. While she struggled to pay bills and raise Emily, Jack had almost limitless resources. No matter how humble and considerate he seemed, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that their lives were fundamentally incompatible. That tension came to a head one afternoon when Jack unexpectedly showed up at the hospital where Sarah worked. He carried an envelope with a proposal for a scholarship to a prestigious private school for Emily. I thought this might take some weight off your shoulders, Jack said with a warm smile. Sarah took the envelope, but her expression betrayed more tension than gratitude. Jack, I appreciate this, but I can't accept it. Why not? It's something good for Emily. It's not a gift for you, it's for her. I know, but I want Emily to grow up knowing that everything she has was earned through my efforts, through our hard work. I don't want her to think we rely on others to have a better life. Jack remained silent for a moment, trying to understand what Sarah was truly saying. Sarah, this isn't about you or me. It's about Emily. I just want to help. And I appreciate that, Jack, but I can't. It's important to me to show her that we can overcome challenges on our own. Jack felt a wave of frustration. He was trying to do something good, but it seemed like every gesture was being taken as an intrusion. So, what's the point, Sarah? Should I just walk away and pretend none of this ever happened? That I don't care about you or Emily? Sarah met his gaze, her voice firm but filled with emotion. The point, Jack, is that maybe you don't understand what it's like to live on the other side. And as much as I appreciate everything you've done, I don't know if I can make room for someone in our life who doesn't know what it means to fight for every little thing. Jack stayed quiet, absorbing her words. Instead of reacting with anger, he finally understood what Sarah was trying to protect, her dignity and the unique bond she had with Emily. "Maybe I'll never fully understand," Jack said, his voice calm and sincere, "but I want to learn. And I want to do that with you." Sarah was taken aback by his response but said nothing. She needed time to process. Later, when she arrived home, she found Emily sitting on the couch with her teddy bear. "Is Jack not coming anymore?" the little girl asked, her eyes filled with sadness. Sarah sighed, sitting down beside her daughter. "He just needs some time, sweetheart." Emily, with her childlike wisdom, hugged her mother and said, "You always tell me that everyone deserves a second chance." Those words echoed in Sarah's mind. The next day, she called Jack. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice softer than it had been during their argument. "Of course, I'd love to," Jack replied without hesitation. The meeting was simple, set in a quiet cafe. They both apologized and agreed that they needed to work together, not as people from different worlds, but as two individuals willing to build something greater. Months passed since Sarah and Jack reconnected at the cafe. During that time, their relationship with Emily grew naturally, filled with ups and downs but always marked by increasing honesty. Jack remained present in their lives, learning to respect the boundaries Sarah had set and showing that his interest went deeper than grand gestures. One day, Jack decided to surprise Sarah, Emily, and Margaret with a trip to a coastal town in Maine, a place he had spent summers during his youth. Though Sarah was initially hesitant, she eventually gave in to Emily's excitement and Margaret's affectionate insistence. The house Jack rented was simple and cozy, with a stunning view of the ocean. Over the weekend, they walked along the beach, collected seashells, and shared stories around a bonfire. It was during one of these evenings, as the waves crashed in the distance, that Jack finally mustered the courage to open his heart. "Sarah, since I met you and Emily, my life has changed in ways I never imagined. You've taught me to see what truly matters, and I'm a better man because of it." Sarah looked at him, surprised by the intensity in his voice. "Jack, you've been more than I could have hoped for. And I've changed too. You've shown me that not everything has to be so hard, that sometimes accepting help isn't a weakness, but a strength." Jack smiled, gently taking her hand. "I don't want to just be a part of your lives. I want to build something with you, together, if you'll let me." Sarah, moved, nodded. "I think we've already started building, Jack." Meanwhile, Emily and Margaret were in the kitchen, roasting marshmallows. Margaret, glancing out the window at the two of them, smiled with quiet satisfaction. The next day, Jack surprised Sarah and Emily with a visit to a small plot of land near the sea. "I bought this place," he said. "I thought maybe we could build a house here someday. No rush, just a dream for the future." Emily ran across the open field, laughing with joy, while Sarah stood beside Jack, touched by the vision he had for them. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "And so are you, Jack." "I never thought I'd have something like this," Sarah said, tears welling in her eyes. "Neither did I," Jack replied, pulling her into an embrace. In the months that followed, they continued to plan their future together. Sarah kept her job at the hospital but now found a better balance between work and personal life. Margaret moved into the new house once it was finished, helping to raise Emily, who thrived even more with all the love surrounding her. Jack, for his part, learned to delegate at work, prioritizing his new family above everything else. Looking back, no one could have imagined how a chance encounter in a forest would change so many lives. But in that new seaside home, filled with laughter, conversations, and simple moments, it was clear that each of them had found exactly what they needed: love, purpose, and a true home. If you enjoyed this story, please leave a comment to share your thoughts, subscribe to the channel, and stay tuned for more heartfelt stories in the upcoming videos.